So I'm not in the car, I'm in my office. And honestly, the content of today's video, if I had more time, I probably would have made a podcast episode about it. But I'm short on time. And I want to get pretty deep and nuanced um, and read a few passages to you today that really illustrate the wide variety of ways of looking at manifesting a better life. And one reason that I say, first and foremost, you got to do what resonates with you. That's the most important thing. You got to utilize the tools and teachings that resonate with you. And you have to realize that a lot of these ideas are described in very different ways. I often like to say, and I'll put a link above to a podcast episode I did at this point, like a couple of years ago, I think, um, talking about two ways of looking at these manifesting ideas that are very different and that I think are very helpful um, to look at. And excuse me, you know what? Actually, I won't. That link is not necessary because I'm thinking about what's actually in that podcast episode. That's not necessary. I'm not going to put that link there. Instead, I just want you to understand, and if you look on my channel, you see many examples of me talking about this, that we can basically separate these manifesting ideas into more spiritually sounding ideas, which is the majority of this LOA stuff we hear about that's popular, right? And then we can separate it instead, if we want, into more psychologically sounding ideas, right? Not as many popular manifesting teachers just use psychological language in describing, how to go about applying this stuff in our life. More of them, more of the popular ones, use more spiritual sounding language, more metaphysical sounding language. But the thing is, in my opinion, they're essentially pointing at the same thing. Um, and I think the spiritual sounding language, the mystical sounding language, as wonderful as it is, usually it's still intended to improve your life on a practical level, right? And I question when we hear all this very grandiose metaphysical language in LOA. I question a lot of time if it's really necessary to use it. And this is coming from somebody who likes hearing lovely metaphysical language some of the time, right? But I think it's often overkill. And as I've said before, the podcast episode I was going to link to, I will now link above to it. Uh, the episode I did a few years ago, really, it was saying that there's two types of spirituality, which is this more like deeply uh, ineffable type of spirituality, just very deep. It's like truth, just right there, experienced, right? There's that kind of spirituality, and then there's this more practical, I'm going to improve my life spirituality. I'm going to help improve the lives of others. I'm going to follow the golden rule and do unto others what I want done to myself. I really think that LOA falls in the latter camp most of the time, even when the language is very spiritual sounding. I would argue it's actually not usually as quote unquote spiritual or as deep or as ineffable as a lot of the various mystical traditions that are famous, or some of my favorite mystical spiritual teachers. The people I always name that are modern-ish, like Byron Katie, Jan Fraser, Nisargadatta Maharaj, Yuji Krishnamurti. Teachers like that are deeply spiritual. And I don't think these LOA teachers are usually like that, even though they're using very spiritual sounding language. They're more practical. This is a deep point, and again, it's rather nuanced and something I like to talk about and isn't discussed enough. I mean, to be blunt, besides myself, I've seen very few people discuss this point with any type of regularity. So I want to read to you today from, in my opinion, the most practical sounding manifesting teacher that I know of. Also my favorite manifesting teacher, Emile Coué. Because you'll see how in this passage, I think, especially if you're familiar with Coué, and if you follow this channel, you already probably are familiar with Coué, and I'll put the Coué playlist above, and I'll put a link below to Simple Self-Healing, which is the book I'm going to be reading from. If you're familiar with Coué, you know that he didn't use spiritual language, and he said that autosuggestion is just part of who we are as human beings. It's not like a spiritual concept, right? And then I'm going to compare it by reading something from one of my favorite mystical sounding LOA teachers, a very spiritual guy who nonetheless, I think, is still getting at a lot of the stuff that Coué talked about. I'm going to read from Joel Goldsmith. And I want to put one more link before I do this that's worth mentioning. I made another podcast episode like a year or so ago talking about how we overcomplicate things and how using very simple, keep it simple, stupid, KISS, like the KISS method, can help us with LOA. And two KISS methods that I talked about in that podcast episode that are relevant to the two teachers I'm reading from are just, consciously autosuggesting or affirming something to yourself over and over again in a passive way, in the way that Coué masterfully describes. And another really great KISS method is basically what Goldsmith talks about. If we strip away all the religious language, which I love how Goldsmith uses the religious language, but really what Goldsmith's talking about, another very simple method, is just to sit and to just contemplate on being present, to just literally sit down. So in this podcast episode I did last year, I said, we skip over the most simple stuff that is often the most helpful. Things like using conscious autosuggestion and things like just sitting on our butts for 10 or 15 minutes at a time. Or Goldsmith said, just sit down and basically do nothing except contemplate God, right? By just doing nothing for 3, 4, 5 minutes at a time, several times a day. I personally often like to do it for longer than that, and maybe not as many times a day as Goldsmith did. But you get the point. Very simple. It's very simple to consciously autosuggest something before bed and when you wake up in the morning, or sometimes during the day. It's very simple to just sit on your butt and just be once, twice a day for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. Very simple. And these are some of the best, quote unquote, techniques we can use, in my opinion. But it almost seems like different things, because these teachings seem so different in terms of their approach and their language. Coué with his highly practical language, Goldsmith with this highly mystical religious language. Yet I would say they're basically pointing, at least for the most part, to the same thing, right? So this chapter I'm going to read from Simple Self-Healing, which is a book I edited of Coué's teachings. The chapter is called Autosuggestion Has No Relation to Religion. Coué says, I confess I fail to see any relation between religion and autosuggestion. Is medicine a challenge to the church? Autosuggestion is only the use of natural forces and functions of our being, and can be practiced by Catholics and Protestants, Muslims or Buddhists, without violating any of the precepts or doctrinal principles of those churches or religions. Didn't St. Paul write of the faith that moved mountains? Surely it cannot be wrong to make use of the faculties which the Creator Himself has given us. Autosuggestion has no connection with religion. Some religious leaders look suspiciously at autosuggestion because it's come to be associated with alleged quote unquote miracles, which I'm supposed to have worked. Now, as I've said, miracles do not exist. I've never accomplished any and never shall. As a matter of fact, the so called miraculous cures are the simplest and the most easily explained of all. They prove that, actually, the sufferers only thought they were sick. Thought produced or prolonged the symptoms. In that respect, they were really sick. But directly they were made to realize that their ills could be overcome by imagination, so they were cured. It's a very profound passage. So Coué said in many places, including here, that he didn't believe in miracles. And I'm not saying that you should believe in miracles or not believe in miracles. And I'm not saying even that, like, I believe in miracles or don't believe in miracles, right? What's interesting is that Coué, who many people would say, if you looked back, facilitated more miraculous cures than any of these more other famous law of attraction teachers that came after him. And again, this is not an exaggeration. Coué did amazing stuff with people, and there were all these seemingly miraculous healings. Coué said none of them were miracles. He said, I don't believe in miracles. Because it's just how your imagination works. You've inadvertently been imagining you're ill, you're sick. And all I've done is show you that that's a veil that can be lifted because it's you who are creating it. And as soon as you lift the veil, you start to get better. Or if it's, what's usually considered a miracle, you immediately get better. For instance, somebody who has been quote unquote paralyzed for 2 decades, Coué would be able to sometimes get them to walk within 20 minutes of meeting him. And he says this is no miracle. This is just the person thought that their body was still injured from whatever accident they originally had when it was not. It was already healed. It was regenerated. But they imagined they were still essentially paralyzed, and they were not. That's an extreme example, but it gives you an idea of what Coué was getting at. And again, I would argue that what Coué is talking about really is the basis of most of these more spiritual sounding LOA teachings. It's still about our imagination and how our imagination basically overruns everything else. And that's, of course, what Neville often talked about as well in much more spiritual sounding language. Coué managed to take out all that spiritual language. Someone else who always used spiritual language and used it wonderfully, just like Neville, is Joel Goldsmith. I want to read to you Goldsmith from The Art of Meditation. I'll put a link below to this book as well. And I'll put a link above to the Goldsmith playlist. I want to read to you how Goldsmith talks about these ideas and about meditation. Essentially, sitting on your butt and being, right? It sounds very different than what Coué just talked about. And again, that's why these ideas can confuse us so much, because they seem so different. And what I'm saying in this video, what I've said in many previous videos and podcast episodes is no, they're not that different. They're all pointing at the same thing. But it can be very confusing, especially when you hear a description like this and if it resonates with you, as it does with me. This is Goldsmith giving a brilliant explanation of how you can meditate, or how you basically should meditate in his view. And this seems highly spiritual. It seems religious. Well, Coué said that conscious autosuggestion, what we're imagining, is not religious at all. It's just how we're built. So we have to bridge these gaps and figure out what works for us and what this means. Because I agree with what Coué says, and I agree with what I'm about to read that Goldsmith says. This is a wonderful passage. He writes, "Let us remember that our object is to develop a state of receptivity to the still small voice. In meditation, we do not think about our problem. We turn within and wait and wait and wait. We wait for 3, 4, or 5 minutes. If at the end of that time we have not felt the response within ourselves, we get up and go about our customary duties. An hour or two later, we again meditate, waiting silently, waiting until the voice of God utters itself within us. The thoughts that race through our mind do not concern us. We are not interested in them. We are waiting until we feel the activity of the Christ stirring within us. If we do not feel the touch of the Christ within 3 or 4 minutes, we return to our daily tasks, but 2 or 3 hours later, we meditate again." So that sounds very different, doesn't it? What does that have to do with autosuggestion? I've made a couple of videos about this, trying to link what Goldsmith talks about with autosuggestion, what Coué talks about. It's worth contemplating. We start working with our mind, our imagination, our consciousness. We realize a power within ourselves that's not our normal concept of ourself, but something seemingly greater. You can call it imagination, you can use psychological terms, or you can call it God, and use very spiritual, religious sounding terms. But I think it's worth exploring. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or would like coaching or would like a free short consultation with me, I can be reached at radicalcounselor.com.